Welcome to the debate. If you want to dramatically increase child vaccination rates in a developing nation, do you restructure the entire Ministry of Health, or do you just hand out a 2-pound bag of lentils to every parent who shows up at the clinic?
I mean, on paper, the lentils sound completely absurd.
Right? It sounds ridiculous. But in rural India, researchers found that offering that tiny, immediate incentive, literally a bag of lentils, actually increased immunization rates 7-fold.
Wow. Sevenfold.
Yeah, it didn't require a political revolution. It just required understanding human behavior.
Sure, but to be fair, handing out lentils doesn't build a hospital, and it certainly doesn't build a national economy.
Okay, true.
A bag of lentils might get a child vaccinated, which is obviously good, but what kind of economy is that healthy child going to grow up and participate in? I mean, if there are no actual industries to employ them, you haven't solved poverty, you've just slightly improved the conditions of their survival.
And that tension right there is exactly the core of our discourse today. We are looking at the fundamental challenge of global economic development and, poverty alleviation.
The big stuff.
Exactly. The central question we're unpacking is this: does the true path out of poverty lie in rigorous micro-level behavioral interventions, really optimizing the granular mechanisms of policy, or does it require macro-structural, state-led industrial policies and aggressive trade protectionism?
Right.
We're drawing on extensive economic literature here, massive randomized controlled trials, and deep historical analyses of global trade to anchor this discussion. And I'll be representing the microeconomic perspective today. I argue that poverty is best solved by understanding the behavioral realities of the poor, alleviating the crushing burden of cognitive scarcity, and really relying on strictly evidence-based interventions to solve localized problems.
And I will be taking the macro-structural perspective. It's a profound divide, honestly, and the stakes really could not be higher.
Definitely.
My position is that, while local interventions might ease daily suffering, true national wealth is only generated through state-led industrial policy. We have to recognize the historical reality of how wealthy nations actually developed, which frequently involve kicking away the ladder of development to keep poorer nations from climbing up behind them.
So let's dive into that. Because for decades, the development world was completely obsessed with grand ideological theories. You had people arguing for massive trillion-dollar aid injections.
Right, the big top-down approaches.
Exactly. And others demanding sweeping free market shock therapy. But those grand theories consistently failed because they ignored the nuanced, messy realities on the ground.
Well, I come at it from a different way. I don't deny that granular data is useful. I mean, we need data. But focusing purely on micro-interventions and behavioral nudges is it's akin to applying Band-Aids to a structurally broken system.
You really think they're just Band-Aids?
I do. Because no country in the history of the modern world has transitioned from widespread poverty to national wealth solely through, optimized fertilizer subsidies. It just doesn't happen.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what those Band-Aids actually achieve. Because they are grounded in how human beings actually operate, particularly under the extreme stress of poverty. Take the concept of the scarcity mindset.
Okay.
The mental bandwidth of the poor is constantly consumed by the sheer mathematics of survival. If you are spending all day figuring out how to afford tomorrow's calories, you suffer a massive cognitive tax. Your brain is literally overloaded.
I understand the psychology, and this is the key thing, how does that translate to actual economic policy?
Well, it explains choices that look totally irrational to outside observers. Like, why would someone in extreme poverty buy a television instead of investing that money in a business? Or, a distant, highly uncertain savings account?
Because of the immediate relief.
Right, because the television offers immediate, guaranteed psychological relief from the crushing stress of their daily life, whereas the savings account offers a vague promise of security years down the line. We call this time and consistency, valuing a small comfort today over a larger but abstract reward tomorrow.
Yeah, time and consistency.
Once you realize these are entirely rational choices under extreme stress, you realize poverty isn't a singular structural monolith. It is a series of specific solvable problems. That's why randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, have totally revolutionized the field.
Sure, they provide good data.
By testing policies the exact same way we test medical drugs. Like giving an intervention to 50 villages and withholding it from 50 others, we separate comforting assumptions from effective reality.
It is solvable, yes, but not by merely optimizing localized behavior. Look, today's rich countries developed using the exact opposite of what they now prescribe to developing nations.
The exact opposite?
Yes, they utilized heavy tariff protection, they nurtured their infant industries behind massive walls of state support, and they relied heavily on state-owned enterprises. Framing poverty primarily as a behavioral failure completely obscures the massive, engineered structural disparities in the global economy.
Okay, but let's talk about the efficacy of these micro-interventions, though, because tweaking the delivery of a policy yields absolutely massive returns without needing some geopolitical overhaul. Look at the Indonesian rice subsidy program.
The ID card one?
Yeah, this was a nationwide initiative that was just totally failing because the subsidized rice wasn't reaching the poor. Now, a structuralist might look at that and say, oh, the government is entirely corrupt. We need a revolution to fix the system.
Or, well, at least a fundamental restructuring of local institutions and market incentives.
But the solution they found was brilliantly simple. They realized the issue was just an information bottleneck. Local leaders were intercepting the rice and overcharging the villagers, who literally had no idea what the official price was supposed to be.
Right.
So, researchers tested a micro-intervention. They mailed identification cards directly to the eligible households, and on those cards, they printed the official subsidized price of rice.
And that bypassed the local leaders?
Exactly. That one tiny change drastically reduced corruption and massively increased the subsidies reaching the families. The villagers finally had the exact information they needed to demand their rights. Waiting for a perfect macroeconomic revolution is, it's like waiting for a perfect fire department while refusing to hand out fire extinguishers to a burning neighborhood.
Look, handing out fire extinguishers is a moral imperative. And I am not arguing against saving lives in the interim. Of course not.
Good, I'm glad we agree on that.
But let's look at another darling of the micro-intervention world to see where this logic hits a wall. Microcredit.
Oh, you mean the practice of giving very small loans to entrepreneurs in developing countries?
Yes. For a long time, the promise was that lending tiny amounts of money to poor individuals would organically grow an economy from the grassroots up. I mean, it won Nobel Prizes.
It was hugely popular, yeah.
But what did the gold standard RCTs actually show when they studied microcredit over the long term? They showed it fundamentally failed to lift average households out of poverty.
Well, largely because the businesses didn't scale.
Precisely. Let's break down why it fails. If you give 50 people in the same rural village a $50 loan, what happens?
They don't build factories.
No.
They all buy wheelbarrows and tomatoes. Suddenly, you have an oversaturated market of tiny, struggling businesses selling the exact same tomatoes to the exact same impoverished neighbors. It doesn't create scalable, high-productivity industries. It just creates debt.
So what's your alternative? True economic transformation requires stable, well-paying jobs. The source material highlights the Mexican maquiladoras, the manufacturing plants near the border. When those assembly plants opened, they provided a reliable income floor.
Right. Factory jobs.
And the result? Mothers with stable factory jobs had structurally taller, healthier children simply because they had a predictable wage every single week. You don't get that stability from a microloan to buy a single sewing machine. You get it from industrial scale.
Okay, I hear you on the maquiladoras providing an income floor, and I don't disagree that stable jobs are the ultimate goal here. But the real question is, how does a state actually get those factories?
By building them.
But trying to artificially build those industries from the top down often leads to massive state debt, inefficiency, and frankly, corruption. I would argue the state's most effective role isn't trying to micromanage global trade. It's investing in the human capital required to organically attract those factories in the first place.
By doing what exactly?
By alleviating the cognitive tax we discussed earlier. The poor are forced to make exhausting daily calculations. They have to manually boil water to purify it, They have to navigate complex illnesses without preventative medicine. They have to seek out basic financial security.
Sure.
If a state focuses on providing clean water infrastructure, default savings accounts, and highly targeted health subsidies, like those lentils for vaccines, it frees up the mental bandwidth of its citizens. The state should build the foundational environment that allows human capital to flourish naturally, rather than attempting to, artificially manipulate heavy industry.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are diagnosing poverty as an individual cognitive overload issue, but you are completely ignoring the historical reality of how states actually built the capacity to offer those stable environments.
How so?
You cannot build a modern economy on behavioral nudges while international institutions literally tie your hands on trade.
Oh, you're referring to the concept of kicking away the ladder.
Yes, let's look at 18th century Britain under Robert Walpole, or the 19th century United States under Alexander Hamilton. How did they build their economies? It certainly wasn't through free trade and micro-interventions. Hamilton practically invented the theory of infant industry protection.
Wait, hold on. Let me make sure I understand this argument. You're saying we need to look at policies from the 1700s and 1800s to solve 21st century poverty?
The mechanics of national wealth generation haven't changed. Back then, the British manufacturing sector was an absolute juggernaut. A newly independent America couldn't possibly compete on price.
Right, they were too small.
So Hamilton and the United States utilized massive tariffs, up to 50%, to make British goods artificially expensive. This forced Americans to buy American goods, which provided their fragile, inefficient domestic factories the breathing room they needed to learn, make mistakes, and eventually scale up to compete globally.
And Britain did the same thing?
Britain did the exact same thing to protect its woolen manufacturing from the Low Countries centuries prior.
Okay, hold on. I understand the historical point, but are you seriously suggesting that a 50% tariff in the era of Alexander Hamilton translates perfectly to today's highly integrated world of globalized supply chains?
The principle translates.
But protecting an infant industry today often just shields corrupt state-owned monopolies from ever having to innovate. It literally forces local citizens to pay triple the price for terrible domestic products.
It carries risks, absolutely. But what is the alternative being forced on developing nations today? When they try to build the very industries that would provide those stable, stress-relieving jobs you want, they are told by the World Bank and the IMF to accept radical free trade.
Which they argue promotes growth.
But they are forced to drop their tariffs to 10% or less. The rich countries climb to the top of the economic ladder using intense state protectionism, and once they were at the top, they kicked the ladder away. They turned around and told the developing world that industrial policy is inefficient. It's historical hypocrisy, and it traps developing nations as exporters of cheap raw materials.
Look, that is a fair observation about the hypocrisy of global trade politics. I'll give you that. However, even if we assume a developing nation is entirely blocked from using aggressive industrial protection, they still have access to the ultimate universal engine for economic growth, human capital.
Okay.
And this brings us to education, where the micro perspective reveals massive, totally solvable flaws in how we build that capital.
Human capital is essential, but it is deeply misunderstood by the micro perspective.
Well, I would argue it's misunderstood by the grand systems currently in place. The systemic failures in developing education systems are staggering, and they are largely behavioral and informational. Take the S-shaped curve illusion.
Which is the belief parents hold about the financial returns on education, right?
Correct. Many parents in extreme poverty look around their village and observe that having 3 years of primary school doesn't get you a better job than having 1 year of primary school. So they mistakenly conclude that the financial returns on education are completely flat for the first few years and only spike exponentially if a child makes it all the way to secondary school or college.
Right. The S-shape.
Yes. And because these parents have severely limited resources, they make a tragically rational but mathematically flawed calculation. They hyperinvest all their money, their tutoring, and their hope into the one child they deem the most promising.
And abandon the others?
Exactly. They practically abandon the education of their other children early on. They put all their eggs in one basket because they don't realize that every single year of education actually provides a steady, incremental return in lifetime earnings.
which creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of inequality within the family itself.
Yes. And it is compounded by the schools themselves. Picture a 10-year-old child who works as a street vendor. This child can rapidly perform complex mental arithmetic, calculating exchange rates and margins from multiple items in their head while making change on a busy street corner.
Sure.
But when you sit that exact same child down in a classroom and give them a standard written math problem, they fail. Why? Because the curricula are rigid, elitist, and completely disconnected from their intuitive knowledge. We call this the gap between market math and school math.
So what is the micro-intervention fix here? Just changing the textbook?
No, it's an intervention known as teaching at the right level. Instead of forcing children through a rigid curriculum based purely on their age, you group them by their actual learning level. You focus relentlessly on mastering the absolute basics of reading and math before moving to complex theories.
Okay.
It is a highly localized pedagogical shift, and RCTs prove it is one of the most potent levers for societal mobility. It unlocks millions of minds without needing, a 50% import tariff on steel.
Look, that is a compelling argument for reforming education. I'll admit that. But have you considered the ultimate utility of that human capital in a stagnant macroeconomy?
What do you mean?
Let's say your behavioral nudges work perfectly. You fix the S-curve illusion, parents invest equally in all their children, and you implement teaching at the right level across the entire country. You successfully generate millions of perfectly educated, highly numerate, healthy citizens.
That sounds like a massive win.
But what happens when those citizens graduate into an economy that has no high-value manufacturing sector to absorb them?
Well, they innovate. They utilize that education to become entrepreneurs and solve local inefficiencies.
But we already discussed the tomato vendor analogy. Micro-entrepreneurship doesn't scale without structural capital. If a nation cannot protect its industries and build real economic capacity, generating all this human capital will simply lead to a highly educated, deeply frustrated, underemployed underclass.
You think they'll just be underemployed?
Absolutely. You will have people with high school and college degrees driving taxis or selling those exact same tomatoes. This is why I fundamentally reject the micro-accession. When the free market macro policies forced upon developing nations inevitably fail to produce growth, the international institutions just blame metastructural factors.
Metastructural factors like geography or culture?
Yes, they look at a failing economy and say, oh, it's their tropical climate, or it's their geography, or worse, it's their cultural mindset. They just lack an entrepreneurial spirit.
Right.
These arguments are often just convenient excuses to mask the failure of the policies forced upon them. If an economy isn't growing, it's not because the local street vendor can't do written school math. It's because the nation has been stripped of the macroeconomic tools required to build an industrial base.
That's an interesting point. Though I would frame the micro perspective very differently. Focusing on the micro level is not about blaming the poor or their culture. In fact, I'd say it is the exact opposite.
How so?
The micro perspective is fundamentally about profound empathy and respect. It recognizes that people in poverty are hyper-rational actors, navigating a landscape of impossible choices.
Empathy is vital, yes, but empathy alone doesn't build factories.
No, but empathy designs policies that actually work for the people living in those systems today, rather than sacrificing them for some theoretical industrial future.
Fair enough.
To summarize my position, the path forward must be grounded in empirical realities, not abstract historical ideology. We have spent decades debating whether capitalism or state intervention is the silver bullet, and meanwhile, people are suffering. Progress is made millimeter by millimeter.
Like printing the price of rice on an ID card, it is made by providing a bag of lentils to overcome time inconsistency so a child actually gets vaccinated. It is made by respecting the complex, rational choices the poor make every day and adjusting our policies to meet them exactly where they are.
And I will summarize by saying that while millimeter progress absolutely saves lives, and we should continue to do those things, kilometer progress requires structural courage. We cannot lose sight of the forest because we are meticulously cataloging the leaves.
Okay.
If we want nations to transition out of poverty permanently, we have to look at the actual history of economic development, not just idealized free market models. Developing nations must reclaim the sovereign right to use industrial policy to protect their infant industries and to build their macroeconomic capacity. Optimizing daily survival is noble, but the ultimate goal must be the structural generation of national wealth.
Well, it seems we agree on one fundamental truth at least. Poverty is a systemic failure, not a personal one.
Absolutely.
Whether you view that failure through the lens of crushing cognitive scarcity on an individual level or through the lens of unequal global trade dynamics and historical hypocrisy, the burden should not rest solely on the shoulders of the impoverished.
Indeed. The material we've explored today holds even more layers regarding how these behavioral realities and macro forces inevitably collide in the real world.
Because at the end of the day, handing out lentils and fixing the immediate bottlenecks of human survival is critical, but so is ensuring those surviving citizens have a robust economy to thrive in. We leave it to you, the listener, to ponder which lever ultimately holds the key to global prosperity. Thank you for joining us.